Hey students, welcome to our World Up to 1750 lecture and notes. So for your notes today, guys, you're going to answer these three questions. When you answer these three questions, I want you guys to make sure that you proofread all of your answers and use a proper sentence structure and syntax, capitalize the correct words, have sentence starters, don't just bullet point. And please abide by the amount of sentences I ask you to write for each one. If you guys can't do that stuff, you won't get credit for the assignment, so please make sure you're following the directions. The first question that you guys want to look at, well, let's review them, all three of them right now before we go in, so you guys could have this up on your computer as I am doing the lecture here. Now, you also notice that this slideshow isn't on your assignment because, again, you have to watch this video to get the notes, so I want to make sure you guys go through it all. So question number one is going to ask you, according to the divine right of kings, where does a king's right to rule come from? Who creates the laws of a state? And do you think the king has to abide by the laws that are created? Number two asks, what privileges did the elite groups of the era have that the commoners did not? You must explain. And number three asks, what do you think are some ways commoners could take political power from the elites? All right, the question we are looking to answer when we do this slideshow is, what is absolutism and how did it influence the world into 1750? Now, where we left off, we talked about our foundational cultures, the Greek and Romans. And then after the Greek and Romans, we have what we call the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, where the world is fueled by different crises. There's a bubonic plague, there's war, and from all of these crises, we see a rise of a look back of our foundational cultures to guide us into a new way of living. We're trying to get out of the Dark Ages in 1750. But when does that really start? Well, it starts with the Renaissance and the Reformation. Okay. So, what is the Renaissance? Between 1350 and 1550, Italian intellectuals were living in a new age called the Renaissance, which literally means rebirth. And what they meant was a rebirth of the Greek and Roman cultures and ideals that impacted our country as well. So, this is going to show you guys historically that when the Renaissance began, it led all the way up to our culture now and our beliefs now. Now, during the Renaissance, people believed in the value of the individual. Men could achieve anything they desired, and Leonardo da Vinci was one of the famous inventors, artists, sculptors, mathematicians of the time. He's probably one you've heard of. He painted the Mona Lisa. There was also a big influence on modern Western artwork from the Renaissance. You also see the questioning of the Catholic Church start to happen during the Renaissance, because prior to that, during the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, those crises led people to giving soul power and being really obedient to the political powers, which was intertwined with religion at the time. So because of this rebirth in ideas, people are starting to now break away from Catholic Church ideals, and it even leads to what we call is the Protestant Reformation. Now, the Protestant Reformation, it was during the late Middle Ages, and the Catholic Church had accumulated so much power up to that point that they started doing things that weren't really from Catholic doctrine. Martin Luther, who was a Catholic monk, saw the corruption in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church faced corruption at the end of the Middle Ages due to politics becoming involved with the church. They sold salvation for money, and they would call these things indulgences. They sold positions in the church in exchange for political power. Luther called out all this corruptness, all these things in his 95 Thesis, and he basically nailed this 95 Thesis on to church doors so the whole city could see them. So basically, the Catholic Church saw this, and they put Luther on trial. His refusal to recant any of his writings began the Protestant Reformation, where Christianity, modern Christianity appears, Protestantism appears. This Reformation consisted of bloody wars. It produced two main Christian faiths now. Now, Catholicism isn't the only Christian faith, but there's also Protestantism. And from Protestantism, there's hundreds of different Christian faiths, but you have big ones at this time is like Calvinism. Now, let's fast forward a little bit and go back to our world in 1750. Now, because of the crises, because of the war, the Protestant Reformation, because of the bubonic plague, because of all these things happening, people gave power to governments to protect them, okay, to protect them from these things. Now, this is what led to what we call absolutism, Okay. Absolutism is when a monarch, a king or a queen, holds total power in a country or state. It is a response to the crises that plagued Europe the past 1,000 years. By 1750, class tensions were high as the gap between elites and commoners became evident. There was no middle class in absolutism. Elites are like nobles, kingsmen, the rich, and commoners are pretty much everybody else, not born into the wealthy class. Absolute monarchs governed most of the world. The king or queen was subject to no one else and no law. They have total authority over their nation, and the monarch's power was also applied to a country's colonies abroad. The American colonies under the British Empire was an example of one of these absolute monarchs taking power even abroad. In an absolute monarchy, you usually have the king at the head, then you have the nobles and their religious leaders, and lastly, everybody else, the commoners. So why did absolutism work? Well, it worked in the West because many people were Christians. And in Christianity and in Catholicism at this time, people had the idea of the divine right of kings, which basically meant that most absolute monarchs received the right to rule by their birth into a royal family. They were chosen by God to be the king, or else they wouldn't have been born as a monarch. Most of these monarchs also claimed their right to rule came from God and not from the people. They called this the divine right of kings. However, the divine right of kings did not shield the king of revolt from the people. There's many circumstances where people or commoners overthrew a king who was acting as a tyrant. An example of this is King Charles I of England. And fear of revolt limited a king's power. But in the ideas of the divine right of kings, kings ruled because they were chosen to. And the king wasn't supposed to serve the people were supposed to serve the king in this ideology, which is different than what we have now, right? Now we believe the government is made to serve us. So who exactly are the elites and who exactly are the commoners? Well, the elites were the upper class. They consisted of monarchs, nobles, and religious leaders. They were 3.5% of the world population. They were educated, and they had all the political power. Privilege for the elites were based on a person's status as an aristocrat, someone who inherited land, titles, and wealth. An aristocrat is someone who inherited land, titles, and wealth, also based on religious authority, such as bishops in the Catholic Church. They used money to cement their power, and they owned large amounts of land. They were allowed to tax people who lived on their land as long as they gave a portion to the monarch. This is called feudalism, and we're going to talk about that next week. Commoners, they're the lower class of people. They're everyone who did not belong to the elites. They're like merchants, soldiers, laborers, farmers. They're 95% of the world population. They're not educated, and they hold no political power. Most of them were farmers working elites' land. They did repetitive tasks based on common life. They sowed, they weaved, they tended animals, they worked soil. Their livelihood depended on the kindness of the elites to welcome them onto their land and allow them to work it in exchange to sometimes even live on it. Now what I want you guys to do is go to your handout and answer the 3 questions in complete sentences. Make sure you proofread and use proper sentence structure.